All right, well, here we are on Monday morning. Sharif Yunus with Dr. Kevin Majors, and we have some big topics to discuss. Kevin and I got to talk a lot at the end of last week, discussing some new ideas. So we're going to discuss those here again.
Here we are. So, Sharif, what's our big topic for today?
So the big topic is frustration.
That's right.
That's right. So the question, actually, as a computer programmer, I get frustrated a lot when I can't figure something out.
Exactly. So you're working on something, trying to make it work, and it's not working.
The answer just won't pop into my head, and I just can't make it do what I want it to do.
Yep.
Dealing with computers is almost as frustrating as dealing with people, in my opinion. And the lows are low, but the highs are high. I mean, dealing with computers at their best, it can be better than dealing with people. No,
Yep.
I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding.
I think frustration is fascinating because that is actually, I would say, where the deepest opportunities for growth lie. So, because frustration means you've reached the point where you don't have strategies.
Right. It's like you're just kind of banging your head against a wall. And I think
Yes.
with programming, you find yourself doing the exact same thing over and over again. It's like
Exactly. Trying harder.
work this time, and then
Yes.
you reload the page and hope it works the next time.
Yep. And that's what happens when people are frustrated. They can double down on just trying harder.
Yeah.
So they try to push their way or muscle their way or force their way through. And that, I think, is never the way to grow. Growth should never be something forced or even in that sense effortful. This gets into a tricky topic of even what is effort. But many times when people are talking about effort, they're thinking about pushing their way through when they're frustrated. Frustration is simply where people arrive at when they have no strategy that can work. And then this is where the deep thing takes place. What do you do at the moment of frustration? This gets into like the deepest things. You either think of overall, how do you really want to respond here? And ultimately, how do you want to shape this? And how do you want to shape a strategy? Which means you actually reach all the way towards ideals and think, how do I most want to shape this? Or you reach for something that's the opposite, which is what's called a schema. So some fixed belief to explain failure and sort of explain limitation. So you can end up saying, like, I just can't do this. So the example I like to use is a fourth grader, who is learning how to add fractions, and say that as he's there working on it, his frustration level is rising because he keeps on trying to do it, but the strategies aren't working.
Yeah.
Now he can think of taking a step back, using different set of strategies. Maybe he has to be like, I don't know, maybe he has to go and ask for help, and maybe that would be a little bit humble, but so he'll have to like embrace that and figure it out. Or maybe he'll have to be patient and wait until, he can come back to it another time to try. Whatever it is, he could shape that process with strategies. Or if he just keeps trying to force his way through, though, the frustration keeps rising. So frustration produces force, and then that makes him be more and more at risk of just giving up. And if he gives up, the frustration goes away, but now he's going to be having this idea, I just can't do it. Like, this is too hard for me. The situation is too hard for me, or I'm just not capable of doing this. So you either like stretch towards ideals, or you explain the failure with a permanent trait and say effort is actually futile. So ideals always lead people to be forming new strategies, but these fixed beliefs, these schemas, just make effort futile because I just can't do it.
Right.
You could think of also like what happens if you're trying to get along with someone that you find hard to get along with. You can find interacting with them very frustrating. Either you reach toward ideals and you keep strategizing new ways, which eventually can lead them to the breakthrough. Or you just write off and you say, no more strategizing, it's all futile. And you say this person just has a fixed character, they'll never change. Or really you're saying, I'll never change.
So then, so in this moment, how do you actually deal with it? Like, how do you reframe? What's the reframe there? Because
Yeah, I
it's
think often in the moment of frustration, you have to see that is the sign of you have to pause and then reset. How do you really most want to grow here? It's not about just obtaining the outcome.
Mhm.
So it's not, it's actually about it's more about being patient with the process. It's about working the process. It's about trying to have a process that allows you to serve people the most. So you can keep on like thinking, how can I like best grow here? How can I best serve others? And the beginning point is usually patience with it, which means see the frustration as a good thing.
Yeah.
See the frustration as it's like the frustration that you get is the signal of that this is where growth occurs.
Mhm.
And you could go into labeling and seeing everything is fixed and everything is futile, or you can be more open and curious and optimistic, aiming for ideals to go and change it. But you have to pause.
Yeah.
Whenever you get frustrated, you can't just force your way through the problem. You have to pause, take a step back, and then reframe, thinking, what is the ultimate thing I want to be stretching for?
So, but okay, how do you? So now you get frustrated when you're focusing on outcomes, and you're encouraging us instead to think about the strategies, the
The
process,
process,
the ideas
yes.
we're going to be aiming for. But how do you do that when there's something really big on the line? Like if there's a real failure possible, like I'm taking the SAT and
Mm-hmm.
this is my one chance to get into the colleges that I want to, or I'm taking the final math exam, or I'm in a job interview for a
Mm-hmm.
job that I really want. How am I supposed? I mean, the whole point of the process is that the process helps you is the most reliable way to get to the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
It is,
Yep.
it is really the outcome that we want, right?
I would say that true success always is at the level of the process. That what kind of person are you becoming ends up determining how much can you love and serve others for the rest of your life. So all the real good we can do in the world, has to pass through our own growth. And so you can't bypass it with outcomes. And no outcome can make up for a lack of growth in your own character. And so what always is happening here is that people have some false vision of success. So they have some outcome that they're after, that they've turned into some kind of like rule. Like, I will only be able to really help people or be happy if I have this outcome. Well, that rule is just a sign of the schema. So, which gets into this like deeper question, which is, you know, what are they doing when they're getting worried about this outcome?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the worst case scenario that the person is trying to prevent? It's that they have set up a system in which there are categories of success and failure. They're entirely based on outcomes. And then they're afraid that they're going to somehow sort into the lesser category,
The failure category.
the failure category. And so, but that whole category is the schema. So the whole category is the implicit schema. Like, there are two kinds of people: those who do well on the SAT, those who don't do well on the SAT. So, and what they're trying to do is make sure that they don't sort into the lesser category, or there are people who get into the top schools or people who don't get into the top schools. But all of these are really somehow biased ways of sorting people. They're not authentic. And they're all based on these externals that in the end don't matter and don't make people happy. So what makes people happy is actually ideals, because those are inherently rewarding and they lead us to give our best to the world and to those that we love. And so we actually do the best in the world because we're striving to become the best ourselves. Outcomes, many times it's like a lottery, getting into a certain school or getting into this perfect job. But people can turn these outcomes into like idols that they're after, like that I have to get this. Like, they created some fixed rule. I'm only going to be happy with this outcome.
So you're saying that people focus on outcomes, and as a result, they create these categories, which we're calling schemas.
Exactly.
And
In fact, I would say all categories, I'm sorry, but all categories are schemas waiting to happen.
fall short.
Well, in a sense, yeah. I mean, if you're always thinking of yourself as tall or short and you're making decisions based on that,
Yeah.
then trying to mitigate that, trying to prevent, really there's some idea that there's a worst case scenario to one of those. And you're trying to prevent this worst case scenario, but it's always some outcome that is based on something not in your control. Tall and short is a great example because it just shows that many of these things we have no control over. Yeah, but you do have control over whether you even accept the category. Are you going to let your behavior, your life, be determined by some made-up categories that may not matter at all, may not exist at all?
I'm not.
You know, exactly. Yeah. Well, good for you, because then you're going to be free to shape yourself for ideals. See, it's these categories that produce frustration. You know, that people are trying to prevent outcomes because that would sort them into a bad category. The key experience we have of this is not that, oh, I have a schema operating in my head. The key experience is some frustration. That's the sign that these fixed categories are at work, and we're strenuously trying to get into the right outcome category.
So that's what I was gonna ask is how do you know? Because it seems like part of these categories might be implicit, right? It's not all just it's not like you're constantly thinking, oh yeah, I fit into this category, but some of it's subconscious or implicit. So how do you know that these categories or schemas are at work and actually shaping your behavior? Maybe you don't even know it. And then the second kind of related question is, when you're in that state of frustration or seeking a particular outcome, what are the kind of responses that people might have? I think in some cases you might avoid the bad outcome, or you might fight to achieve a good outcome, or so. Yeah, I was just wondering if you can talk through that a little bit.
I think in like the broadest terms, when these categories are at work and people are like strenuously trying to avoid sorting into the bad one, fear is the dominant motive. Okay, and this is a huge driver of why people want status, why people want wealth, why people want the right, credentials. It's all because of fear. Fear of somehow sorting into a bad category, as if there are fixed categories of who is successful and who's not. That's why I say these are always false visions of success. They take one thing that could be part of a successful life and they make that the rule for happiness. Like, my happiness depends on getting into this kind of school or having this kind of job, making this much a year. Well, no, happiness doesn't depend on any of that. Ultimately, happiness is about how fulfilling is your life, which is how full is it of not fear, but motives of love, and that you are seeing all the challenges in your life as an opportunity to grow and to love and serve. So if you're framing every challenge that comes up as something that you can embrace, well, that is very much at the essence of being happy, and it has no dependence whatsoever on outcomes. So it's ultimately, is my life dominated by fear, or is it actually motivated by love? So a sign then of also these categories at work and the fixed mindset behind it is that people feel unmotivated. Because it's like if you're relying on fear to motivate you, then there has to be some lurking bad outcome for you to get moving. Whereas love is able to make use of every opportunity. And love invents opportunities. And it's, in a sense, entrepreneurial. It's looking for ways to keep growing, and it's looking for ways to go in bigger and better ways to actually be able to do good in the world.
Right. What happens? So there's a danger of putting yourself into the lower category, because like if you say I'm not a morning person, or I'm bad at math, so you're kind of, or I'm short, or I don't want to say short is worse than tall, but if you put yourself into the lower category, that's kind of gives you a reason to avoid challenges, because you're kind of discounting yourself, starting off on the wrong foot, discounting yourself at the beginning. What happens when you put yourself into the better category?
You're no better off. And so, for instance, what's the dominant categorization or schemas at work when people are in high school? What would you say?
I mean, I was one of the cool kids, so
Exactly. So being cool, being popular,
yeah,
that's like that's like the high school schema system. Okay, now
that's not
they,
valid. You're saying?
yeah, well, yeah, it's arbitrary, it's silly. So if so, and people eventually need to outgrow it, right? That, and they do. But if you think about being super popular in high school, has the worst case scenario changed for you? Wouldn't doing something super uncool and being made fun of and laughed at be even more of a risk if you're very popular? So like when you're in these false categories, the higher you go, the more you can fall.
Right.
And so the danger actually is in some way worse, the better off you are. Yeah, and the more money you have, the more the risk actually grows of losing everything.
Yeah.
And so you might live in a huge mansion with a huge bank account, but then the company, that's supporting you is starting to falter and you could lose everything. Well, that's a much more precarious situation than if you just had something, sufficient to live on and could live in a little house in a village somewhere. And you wouldn't have these worries. So once you can't win with these categories because it's a false vision of success. And in fact, you're never secure enough. Because if you're dominated by fear, you're always going to need reassurances.
Yeah.
And so you need to keep reassuring yourself that you're still popular or that you're still, smart enough or wealthy enough or athletic enough or whatever the thing is. It's always determined based on outcomes. And generally outcomes that other people can see. So it's how you're really appearing in the eyes of others.
Yeah, and you're also putting a limit on growth. If you have the view, I'm a good student or I'm good at math, then, well, then you don't have to work harder and strategize to become an even better student or even better at math. You're kind of putting a cap, and then you're just
Exactly.
of old growth and using it up, but not kind of refilling the growth so that you can keep.
Yeah, that's what only like when people are actually motivated by shaping their process according to ideals, now they have the possibility of limitless growth precisely because ideals are unattainable, yet always capable of being put into practice. So but you can never fully attain them, so you can always grow. Well, what better system could you have than to have always the potential for sure progress, yet it's never exhaustible? That's precisely what unlocks this like entrepreneurial spirit when it comes to growth. Like now I'm going to try to find every opportunity I can to find ways of growing. Whereas when people have these false visions of success, these categories they're trying to fit into, they can achieve good enough. And unless they're really dominated by fear, in which case they have to constantly reassure themselves, but they could also just be good enough and then they lose motivation. Because the motivation doesn't come from within. It's coming from outcomes and circumstances. The other thing is, it's ultimately things that you don't have control over. So you can't be ever perfectly in control of outcomes. Even being cool in high school, you could still make some, big mistake and do something super uncool, and then people leave you. So it's never really secure because, or like I said, with wealth or anything, you always will have the risk of losing it. Whereas the growth that occurs from ideals cannot be lost. So that actually is within you. And then the actual good you do for others is a real thing, that it's a service you're providing in their life. So it's very motivating.
Yeah. Speaking of entrepreneurial spirit and failure, what do you think of the Thomas Edison quote? Have you heard it? Do you know?
What is it?
I didn't fail 999 times. He's an inventor, so I just found 999 ways that don't work.
Yeah. So it sounds like he had this a sense of perseverance as actually the ideal that he was working for. And so he found a way to in a sense, explain failure that still kept him on the path of success. And ideals allow you to learn from failure and to keep going. So in fact, when you're really motivated by ideals, there isn't failure, like Edison was saying. There's just like finding out what doesn't work. And so you found out, so say you're struggling with one person who's a difficult personality, and you keep trying things and they don't work. Well, you are just making progress figuring out what doesn't work with this person.
Right.
So, but you stay open to the idea that eventually I'm going to find a way of like getting real traction. So you always are using strategies, new strategies, until you get traction. But if you start just excluding the possibility of growth because they are that way, or I am this way, or I just can't do this, and all these fixed traits, then effort becomes futile, and then strategies are worthless. And you just give up, and you lose all sense of agency in life, and you stop challenging yourself.
Yeah, it gets boring because the whole point, the whole thing of ideals is that they allow for infinite growth. But with these schemas, categories, even if you make it to, if you're stuck in the lower one, it's futile and awful and frustrating. If you get to the good one, it gets boring after like 2 days.
Yeah, but once you're caught by the dialectic of the categories, it's hard to get out of it.
Yeah.
The only thing you can do is realize when you're doing things because of fear. Because essentially the motives of fear are almost, basically almost always going to be about these external categories. But the other thing that is great is you're going to feel frustrated. Because frustration means you're afraid that effort is futile.
Right.
But futile effort means you're starting to turn things into traits. Instead of seeing, I just have a certain state of training and I can grow, and others have a state of training, they can grow, everything is malleable and workable, everything just becomes fixed. And then not only are you like trying to sort yourself into the right category, but then you have to find the perfect job. Because if you're fixed and inflexible and incapable of changing, well, then you better just find the perfect job right away. And if it's not perfect after 18 months, you better leave.
Yeah.
And you have to find the perfect, person who is perfect in every way. Otherwise, in 2 years, you better leave. It's like there's a sense that you're just fitting things, like you're trying to sort, these inflexible Lego pieces to find how do they fit together, rather than living things that grow together and can intentionally shape themselves to be better and better and fit better and better.
Right. That's awesome. Well, I think this is a great summary of these ideas, and I'm sure they are things that we'll come back to in future episodes. So
yeah, and please ask us any questions you have on these, or if you have examples that you could actually give us.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
That'd be very helpful, and it'd be great to go through like cases where this is coming up, and to show how this, in future episodes, like how does it fit into our overall picture of growth.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks so much.
Yeah.
We'll be on next week.
Great.